Buenos días, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí en esta mañana de sábado. Antes que nada y de manera muy breve, quería agradecer todo el trabajo invisible que es estrictamente necesario para sostener espacios como este y agradecer a Rosa Hernández, a Maite Méndez, a Sara Parques, a Sergio Rubira, a Katia García Antón, a Jerónimo Cabrera y al señor consejero por hacer que este encuentro con Susan hoy haya sido posible. Y por supuesto también a Jorge con la realización de vídeo y sonido, a Rebe por el registro y a Jorge Soriano y a Silvia Beltrán, que serán las voces que estarán escuchando por los aparatos de traducción simultánea. Y evidentemente agradecer a Susan Schuppli por su generosidad, por su tiempo y por acercarnos en el día de hoy a una pequeña arista de sus modos de hacer y sus saberes a través de esta ponencia en torno a la monografía en proceso que es Cold Cases. Susan es artista, investigadora, vinculada a trabajos de investigación en torno a la cualidad testimonial de la materia. Esta cuestión sobre qué nos cuentan realmente los objetos con los que interactuamos y cómo podemos entrar en contacto con las múltiples capas de información que albergan. A través de trabajos precisamente como Cold Cases o Material Witnesses, publicados hace unos años, se pone de manifiesto cómo un minucioso estudio sobre la realidad material que nos rodea nos permite rastrear y traer a la superficie violencias que permanecen ocultas a simple vista. Un ejercicio estrictamente necesario en estos tiempos en los que urgen nuevas formas de pensar el mundo y acercarnos a metodologías con las que poder desgranar una verdad en eterna disputa. Además de su labor como artista investigadora, Susan dirige el Centro de Investigación Arquitectónica en la Universidad de Goldsmiths en Londres y forma parte del grupo de investigación multidisciplinaria de Forensic Architecture. Y bueno, no me enredo más, recordarles que al final de la conferencia tendremos un tiempito para intervenciones y preguntas. Y nada, sin más les dejo con Susan. Muchas gracias.
Joel, gracias por la invitación. Buenas tardes. Tengo que hablar en inglés. So thank you so much for spending some of your precious Saturday afternoon with us here at the museum. What I would like to do in the time that we have is to signal some of the projects that I'm working on now, and then take you into a series of what I call cold cases. So these are artistic projects. I'm not going to share the forensic architecture investigations that I've done, which looked at the ways in which the police have used temperature as a tool of violence against racialized bodies, often the bodies of migrants. So, and those, I'm not going to talk about those this afternoon. Rather, I want to focus on a series of documentary films that have taken me to various places in the cryosphere, and they're part of a large research project that I've conducted in the Canadian Arctic, in Svalbard, and also in the Himalayas of India, where I have an ongoing sort of research collaboration. So just to say, the title Cold Cases traditionally refers to cases that have yet to be solved. I'm taking that concept for my new book project, and I'm trying to rather make the case that we, for a series of, sometimes they're crimes, sometimes they're colonial crimes, or what I call climate crimes. The book that I'm trying to finish right now is the one called Cold Cases, Thermal Injustice, Elemental Rights, and Frozen Futures. And it's the follow-up book to Material Witness, which was largely a book that looked at different legal cases in which materials were carriers of evidence. I did quite a lot of work in The Hague at the International Criminal Tribunal, followed many cases there where photographs, maps, models, videos, etc., were making their way through the legal proceedings of the court. And I was very interested in understanding how does the legal imagination respond to non-verbal, non-textual forms of evidence and testimony making, So it was really an investigation into the ways in which materials themselves carry evidence of, as Joao was saying earlier, of violence and harms. And then how do you forensically reassemble these fragments to create a kind of narrative or to create an understanding. The new book project, Cold Cases, moves away from the legal and really focuses more on questions of justice. And that is because it has a very strong interest in environmental and ecological issues, and those are not things that are typically, those kinds of harms, those kinds of violations are not usually, accountability rather is quite difficult within legal forums because the relationship between a perpetrator and the site of a crime, so it could be a mining operation, and then the contaminants that enter into the river and affect communities downstream, it's very hard to draw a direct causal relationship, and that's really what is required to prove a legal case. And so I thought the second book really should move away from an analysis of law and how it can produce certain regimes of accountability, to look at the ways in which different rights-based claims are being made by affected communities. Just to say, I'm the principal investigator on a couple of forensic architecture investigations called Designing Resistance, Evidentiary Tools for Indigenous Struggles Against Green Colonialism, working with two researchers. And we have two cases, one in Northern Ontario in relationship to proposed mine on First Nations land, and another case is in Namibia. So here we have John Sackney, who is telling us about the ancestral ways in which the land was used, and he's also talking about practices of storing, in this case, meat, moose from hunting in a sort of, in a hilera, in a kind of like, in a sort of ice house that they constructed. So I was interested, I thought, oh, wow, this is amazing that the work of forensic architecture is linking up to my own interests in exploring things related to the cold geographies of our planet. The other case is a proposed wind farm, so that's what those yellow dots are. So 700 wind turbines, and also a hydrogen plant and a desalination operation on the west coast of Namibia, once again on traditional ancestral Nama land. So I'm sure you're aware of the German colonial genocide that was perpetrated against the Nama. So both of these cases with forensic architecture that we're working on right now we're working directly with the indigenous communities that are trying to make a case against these large-scale infrastructure projects that are being proposed as energy solutions, because they don't take into account the fact that the land that they're being developed on is in fact indigenous land that was stolen, and there has been no recognition of that in certainly not in the Namibian case, more so in Canada, but in Canada there are obligations to consult with indigenous communities. That hasn't happened at all. So this is just to say, right at this moment in time, I'm really working on trying to complete the book project and on these two investigations. And this is part of our community mapping that we did with the Nama in August of last year. So that gives you a little bit of an introduction to the sort of investigative research that I'm doing now, but now I want to shift to the kind of creative and documentary projects that I've been involved with, as I said, in the cryosphere. I'm going to begin with a clip from a project called Signals from Svalbard. And I've been to Svalbard twice, once with a glaciologist on a sailboat where we traveled around the main island for a few weeks, stopping at different glacial sites, and then a second time where I was on the land. And this film, I thought, let's begin with the clip from this because it's largely a project where I use music rather than narration and voiceover. There's a little bit of speaking, but I really wanted to, with this project, to see how could I use like not just sound, but work with a composer to produce a certain kind of shape or a sound design for the project that could carry some of the meaning of the project, because I tend to work within what's called the tradition of the essay film, which is a lot of writing and voiceover narration. So one of my challenges is also how can I use sound and music to add complexity to visual images and also produce a certain kind of effective quality without always having to rely on a narrator to tell the viewer what's at stake. So I'm going to play a clip. This documentary really looks at the ways in which Svalbard has shifted dramatically from historically an archipelago focused on mining, so coal mining, and today it's really data that is being mined throughout the archipelago. There's a tremendous amount of technical and scientific kind of research stations and instruments installed throughout the archipelago. So I'm really trying to create an audio-visual language that takes us from the subterranean darkness of coal into this new realm of extractivism that is about information or data mining. So I'll play a little bit of a clip from that, and so it gives you a sense of how I'm trying to start to develop sonic signatures for projects. A positive feedback loop in which warming leads to permafrost melt, releasing more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. The war in the Ukraine has now delayed the closure of Mine 7, Svalbard's last active coal mine, indefinitely. With Russian supply lines of oil and gas sanctioned, the extraction of dirty energy from the coal fields continues unabated. So that's a project that I did a couple of years ago. As I said, I tried to create a sound design that was largely a music-based mode of kind of storytelling. But my work with these cold cases really begins with ice cores. And we are actually looking at an ice core here, and we can see an ash layer in this volume of ice that's been extracted from Antarctica. So ice cores are the most important evidence for testifying to atmospheric warming, that is to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, because what we have in ice is we have the actual atmospheric chemistry from 800,000 to 1 million years ago. So as it snows, the air molecules are trapped in ice, and climate scientists are extracting the air that is sealed off in a literal kind of, I call these material witnesses, because these are not like tree rings that are proxies for precipitation and other kinds of events. In an ice core, we actually have the actual atmospheric chemistry of our ancient climate histories, and by studying an ice core, which in order to study an ice core, sadly you have to destroy it because you have to get the air out of the ice, so you have to crush it or you have to melt it. But in accessing this material archive housed in ice, we can have a very high resolution data set chronicling or charting the history of climactic kind of changes, because every time it snows, that's a new data layer. So you can imagine in places like the Arctic, Greenland, Antarctica, you could snow 3, 4, 5 times a day, so you'd have 5 data layers in a single day. That's an extraordinary high resolution data set for something that is coming from like planetary systems. So coral, lake bed and ocean sediments, they go back much further in time, but they have a very crude kind of resolution. So ice cores produce a very detailed amount of information about the Earth's atmospheric histories. And this slide here is just to give you a sense. The history of ice coring begins in Greenland in the 1950s, when a series of miners decided, instead of drilling into the geologic mantle of the Earth, they started to drill into the ice sheets and extract these meter-long vertical kind of columns of ice. And in the book where I'm writing about the history of ice cores and also my own work with ice cores scientists, of course I have, I'm writing in real time. So as I write this book right now, I also need to be somehow mindful of the geopolitics that are also unfolding currently in Greenland. So I think that the challenge of writing a book project in which the cases are connected to kind of real world events means that one's writing is in some way always lagging behind the kind of accelerated pace of political events. So I spent time in the Canadian Ice Core Archive, which contains the largest set of ice cores from the Arctic region. Here we have the inside of the National Science Foundation Ice Core Archive in the United States. So this is the biggest ice core archive, and this contains primarily cores extracted from Antarctica. I'm going to show you a couple clips from the documentary I produced with the Canadian Ice Core scientists, because what I was trying to do with this first documentary on ice, I really wanted to figure out a way to tell a story about these really important pieces of Earth evidence, but that are kind of treated like silent witnesses, just lying in the archive, waiting for it to be extracted and sort of studied. And I wanted to somehow create a kind of sonic signature that could suggest to the viewers of the documentary that that ice was a very animate and lively material, that it was not simply this inert matter lying in wait for the sort of scientists to come and then decode its material kind of traces. This is Allison and Martin working in the Canadian Ice Core Archive. They were amazing people to work with, and they also brought in pieces of ice that they thought I would be particularly kind of interested in filming. I have a short clip from a project that I've been following, which is the Ice Memory Project. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this. This is a UNESCO project to save the world's endangered glaciers. So it's based in Grenoble, France. And they've been extracting cores from subalpine glaciers, but other endangered, like tropical glaciers, in this case from the Andes in Bolivia. They've been to Svalbard recently, and those ice cores that the Ice Memory Project is coring are being stored permanently in Antarctica, because the one thing that you need when you're storing ice cores, you need to put them in a purpose-built refrigeration unit that is incredibly energy intensive. So there's a kind of internal irony that these ice cores that are helping scientists understand anthropogenic activities such as global warming are themselves, having to be housed in an archive that's part of the problem, because they have to be kept at -30 Celsius 24/7. So I have a short clip from the project in Svalbard, just to give you a sense of what one of these operations looks like.
This is speed. It's fine. You mean depth or... This is our absolute depth.
Not Chinese.
Sorry, let me just pause that for a sec. What I was going to say is, so by comparison, I now want to play a clip from the Ice Core documentary that I made in Canada, and where you can see I'm trying to develop a somewhat different kind of audio-visual language to the sort of classic documentary kind of footage, and to really work once again with sound in order to help produce a different kind of image, so that the work isn't sort of, I'm trying to, in some way, do what I tend to say, I'm trying to denaturalize the image, to even though I'm making documentary films that are focused on changes in environmental systems and the communities that rely on those systems, I want to pull it away from the kind of classic nature documentary. So I really tend to work with sound to help me do that. So I'll play a little bit from the Canadian Arctic. And this is a very manual ice coring operation because of the location it's not possible to bring in the sort of all of the kind of large-scale technology that they would use in a place like Antarctica and to a lesser degree in Svalbard. So this is a very shallow ice core. In fact, it's largely firn, which is the top layer. So it's really the layers of snow that haven't been fully, compacted to form the kind of deep, deep ice cores that are extracted from Antarctica. Now, just to give you a sense of the operations in Antarctica, one single ice core takes about 5 years to extract because you're pulling several kilometers of ice up. You're taking 1 meter up, pulling it up, taking it out, sending down the drill, drilling another meter, pulling that up. As the deeper you go, you also then have to pour a fluid into that hole because the pressure of the hole otherwise will just compress and destroy the drill. So the deep ice cores, like the IPICA, which is the European Ice Core project that is based at the Italian Cordillera Station in Antarctica, that core took 5 years to extract and cost about $20 million US. So it's an extremely laborious, expensive, logistical kind of operation. What we're seeing on the screen now is, by comparison, a DIY kind of setup. That's Allison, who's working in the Canadian Ice Core Archive. They skied into the site, and it's a very manual, a very manual operation, and they're not going to go that deep. But just, when people think about ice cores, yes, you can drill them again, but they're prohibitively expensive. And what happened in Canada, this is a bit of the story why my interest in the Canadian Ice Core Archive came about. I grew up in Canada, and so I was aware of the Canadian Ice Core Archive, but it really came to my attention one weekend when all of the news reported that the Ice Core Archive had experienced a triple freezer malfunction. So 30,000 years of climate history just melted in a big pool of water on the floor of the Canadian Ice Core Archive, even though this was a state-of-the-art, a brand new sort of facility that had just been opened. Nobody really knows why this happened. And so for the first time, a lot of people became aware of the fact that there are these amazing libraries of ice in countries around the world. In the case of Canada, for a long time, the cores, they were all extracted in the 1970s. There was like a shifting political agenda with the government, and so the government themselves was not interested in keeping this ice core archive going. They said it was too expensive. So it ended up at the University of Alberta in Western Canada. They put funding together, they built a new facility. So it's the new facility that I went to, and that's where I filmed. And so it was really Allison and Martin Sharp, the two people that worked there, that saved this Canadian Ice Core Archive and all the information it holds. So I'll take you into that archive now. we can't do it's, well, I guess it's okay, but it's hard for the video, is that it?
The Canadian Ice Core Archive, now at the University of Alberta, shelters this unique collection of historic ice.
So much, thank you.
Cores from Mount Logan in the Yukon, as well as from the Arctic archipelago, including the Penny Ice Cap on Baffin Island, the Prince of Wales ice field and Agassiz Ice Cap both on Ellesmere Island, and the Devon Ice Cap on Devon Island are all preserved within these cylindrical tubes.
And of course, I'm happy, we'll have time for questions, so I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has about also just how to get into some of these places. I've also been in the Ice Core Archive in Goa, India, which to a lot of, even to myself, I thought, oh, that's a bit peculiar that there's an Ice Core Archive in Goa, of all places. I would have expected that to be somewhere in Ladakh, but in fact, the Center for Polar Research is in Goa because in order, India is has a very significant sort of research presence in Antarctica because to understand the monsoons, you really need to actually study the weather patterns of Antarctica. So I've spent some time in the Ice Core Archive there as well. And here we have just, this is they're getting ready to send the next expedition to Antarctica. But shifting once again, I want to focus now on some of the projects that emerge out of my collaborations in India. And this is a project that we did called Listening to Ice in the Karakoram range of the Himalayas. And this is a really kind of like very large glacier that terminates in a glacial lake. So we were able to deploy a soundtrack sensor. So this is an audio sensor that does real-time audio recordings for 6 months continuously, 24 hours a day. And that sensor is deployed in the water at the base of the glacier. And then using that sensor, we can then study the behavior of and changes in the mass balance of Drangdrung Glacier. So this is a pilot project that we ran, and we were trained by Oscar here, who has sort of pioneered this technique in Svalbard. So here he is with his so he's lowered his hydrophones. This is an acoustic array. So the hydrophone is lowered into the water and then stays there for months on end. And then you can't listen to it, but you need to then transform that acoustic data into a spectrogram, and you can study the frequency of melt patterns, calving events, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, as I said, this is a project that I was involved with more as a researcher. And we also installed a weather station. So here's the GPS base station. And we were working with there's my colleague Farouk and his PhD students. My colleague Faiza, that I continue to work with, Faiza is doing, we also did just field recordings. That's actually the glacier, but it's just covered with moraine and debris. So Faiza is doing more of the kind of just using a handheld zoom, just doing some fairly kind of conventional field recordings, whereas the sound trap is a very specialized instrument, and much more expensive by comparison. The other thing that we did, we also ran workshops with local mountain villagers. In this case, we were lowering some of our microphones into the crevice of the glaciers, and so that people could hear what was going on in the body of this massive kind of glacier. The reason that we were doing this was that we really wanted the people who have the most stakes in what is happening in terms of glacial recession in the Himalayas to have some access to the kind of technical scientific work that we are doing. So we called these deep listening sort of workshops, bringing the local mountain villagers to the glacier, providing transportation, lunch, etc., and then having these sort of sessions of listening, so that because we really wanted to move away from the model where scientists just come to a community and tell people, this is what we're doing, this is why it's important. We thought, like, how can we make science much more a space of hospitality? How can we open up the scientific sort of process and give people some sense of what we're trying to do at the more kind of technical end of things? I'll just play a little bit of a clip.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah, it's good. Azura, zera. Mera. Masuk sudah. Kamu sang sudah mera. Nanti ini. It's like hovering helicopter. Mera. Lima mera. Uzu aku cuci tu payah. Nyanjor, tik nyona. Tik siap. Agak tu sedikit. She wants to listen more. She's telling me that it sounds like a helicopter.
I thought it was nice just to watch people listening and not simply just play I have the recordings of what they were hearing, but I thought there's something really appealing as a viewer of a film to actually see people's expressions, to see people engaged in the act of listening, and the ways that their body is responding. And Jigmet there, I can see he's doing hand movements, which are sort of like the scraping of the ice. But what most people started to say...
so here he is hearing two sounds.
Two sounds.
One like a boiling water.
One like boiling water, and like tea.
And then they're also hearing some ice going with the flow with the water. So that sound is most like cracking sound, like with the boiling also. Like,
so yeah, what Jigmet is saying there, which I thought was really nice as well, was the people, when they were describing what they're hearing, they were describing sounds of ice that connected to their everyday lived experience. The sounds of boiling tea, the sound of a helicopter, etc. And then I won't play very long, but just to give you a sense of what's at stake in this part of the world is very different than the Canadian Arctic, where glacial recession is dramatic, but it's not the source of fresh water. But in Southeast Asia, billions of people rely on the fresh water that is locked in the ice of the Himalayan mountain range. And this is Kulum village. This is one of the 45 villages in northern India that's experienced complete loss of water from its mountain kind of glaciers. So it's one of the first places in India that has seen internal climate refugees. Villagers who've had to leave their village because of the lack of water. I'll play a little bit of a clip here. We're having an interview with an environmentalist who's involved in making artificial glaciers, and he's running a project called the Ice Stupa Project.
So the story of Kulum goes like in the last few decades, how due to global warming, climate change, reducing precipitation, acceleration and melting of glaciers.
But you can just get a sense of the incredible. It's okay, please keep the lights down. I just wanted to
2007, they were
give people a sense of the kind of. You really have a sense of the kind of dryness in this sort of area.
The entire 8 acres of upper village fields empty. They didn't do anything on that. Moreover, on top of it, in 2010, there was a big flash flood. Now, a valley like Kulum, that doesn't have a feeding glacier right on top, but gets fed by glaciers around it, is heavily dependent on spring water sources, which is all through up in the upper valley. Now, these spring water sources, in 2010 floods, they got inundated. There was no other way for water to come out. The olden sources and the olden Uras are water channels, Uras and zinc networks which was working in this village for hundreds of years, they got destroyed. And people lost hope. One after the other, families left the entire village, and what you had was an entire abandoned village, perfect homes, perfect fields, but nobody stayed there.
While we were in Ladakh, we also, because we were very focused with this project called Listening to Ice, using technical sensors, listening to the stories that mountain villagers had about the changes that they were experiencing. Because the project was focused on different forms of listening, we also encountered a song collector and a musician, Morup Nam Gayal, and Morup has been collecting poems, songs, folk songs about mountains, rivers, glaciers, and streams since the 1960s in the region of Ladakh. And these are just some images. This is an image I took of his archive where he's written his notes. And so the archive, it was a big, basically it's just a whole bunch of paper like stuffed into a cabinet, completely like mixed up and in a pretty sorry state, as you can see. And so we worked with Marup. We got some funding from the British Council, and we produced a songbook because they'd be called Singing Ice. And we used this songbook to run workshops with schools, etc. So Marup really wanted young people to have some memory, some of these traditions that Marup was keen that younger people had access to these poems, to these stories that were no longer part of their kind of daily lived experience. And so he was really keen that we work with him to produce a songbook, which we did. This is a couple pages in the book. And the songbook, then we printed it, and it's we distributed it to all the public schools in Ladakh, and then it's also Marup and others continued to use the song book and to run workshops and to teach people these songs and stories that are carried by these old kind of folk songs. So what was, I think, really nice about this project as well was to ask the question, where does knowledge of environmental change reside? You know, of course today when we think about climatic changes and monitoring the transformations that are taking place, we would turn to, more often than not, of course we're going to turn to scientific accounts. But I'm very interested, and this is part of my work with kind of communities, is to ask the question, you know, like how can we expand the archive of information about environmental changes, which means that we have to also engage with kind of cultural materials and the stories and the histories that are also encoded in songs and poems, so that we have a more expansive set of accounts and not just privileging the techno-scientific form of evidence making, but to see how is it that communities who have experienced changes over many generations and have recorded those changes in different sort of cultural forms, how does that have that kind of knowledge, how does that have a role to play as well? And in some way, that brings me also to this. This is the last film project that I made, and I'll play. It'll be my last clip. It's the first time I've really tackled a historic story. So this film is called Moving Ice, and it looks at the ways in which ice was a commodity and a form of cargo primarily in the 19th century. So it was used as ballast in trading ships. And it was also used, of course, as an early form of refrigeration. And the colonial settlements in India were were obsessed with importing ice from the United States, in fact, and Norway was supplying all of the French settlements and colonies, as well as the Dutch East Indies. So ice traveled from Norwegian glaciers to Algeria, and from the eastern seaboard of the United States to ice houses in what was then called Bombay and Calcutta. And this was a kind of global trade and what was actually known as the frozen water trade. So this documentary that I produced looks at the commodification of ice as and the kind of conjunction, the ways in which colonialism and capitalism come together to move ice around the world. It has 13 chapters. I'm just going to play 2 of them. The first one is about the early trade in ice, so I'll play that now. And there's a narrator, and she is, I decided I wanted to have an Indian narrator because the story is really focused, is very focused in India, and I did a lot of the shooting there.
In the early 1800s, colonialism and capitalism had already joined forces to move ice. Not as an unforeseen consequence of industrialization, which we now recognize as a key accelerator of atmospheric warming, but as a commodity in and of itself. What came to be known as the frozen water trade. A trans-hemispheric commerce in natural ice that moved its crystal cargo along the well-established shipping routes of plantation economies and the spice trade. A story about how European and American merchants tried to cool the tropics through the financialization of temperature. shipping natural ice extracted from Norwegian glaciers and winter lakes along the eastern seaboard of the United States to colonial elites around the world. First as ballast in the holds of trading ships and then as commercial cargo. Sometimes using slave labor to unload ships.
Slightly to the side.
When Boston merchants began selling ice to the British settlement in Calcutta, each voyage took upwards of 4 months and covered distances of over 25,000 kilometers. Norwegian ice traveled to the French colony of Algeria in 1839, as well as to Congo, Burma, and as far away as Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies. The moving of a melting commodity that traveled vast distances, losing a third of its mass in transit, is now largely forgotten, replaced by locally made ice. Although the remains of historic ice houses can still be found in the port cities of former colonies.
Towards the end of this film, so this is maybe chapter, I think, 12, I sort of fast forward to the contemporary, and I'm going to play a clip. This isn't something I shot. This is a company in Norway called Sveis, and it's 2 Norwegian entrepreneurs that started ice cube mining for high-end cocktail bars out of Svartisen Glacier, so Norway's second largest glacier, but a glacier that's also an endangered glacier. So I'll just play, this is their advertisement, and then I'll just quickly play that to give you a sense of how this kind of like, this trade in ice has basically shifted, and there's now ever new and enterprising ways of extracting capital from the world's ice sheets.
The glacier is the actual remains from the last ice age, 10,000 years ago.
And you can see the sort
During the
of
last 100 years,
romantic
the ice was used to mark
kind
special
of
occasions.
imagination they're
People
mobilizing.
living in the remote villages around the Svartis glacier would travel by foot across the wild and tough land to collect the ice. A wedding or special dinner occasion was not complete without the ice. This made the party perfect and memorable. Only a select few people in the world are given the opportunity to partake in this experience. And now your dinner party can end with a great spectacle. You will not have to hike into the remote wild land to get to the glacier. We are bringing the exclusive and prestigious ice to you. The world's most wanted ice cube is the perfect companion to your favorite drink. Make your drink more enjoyable. Created by nature, brought to you by Spice.
Fra Svartisen henter selskapet Spice ut is. Små, eksklusive isbiter skal selges til restauranter over hele verden.
Concerns for a primordial landscape on the verge of extinction fired up protesters and environmental organizations. On May 10, 2019, the local council rejected the controversial plan to airlift wild ice from north of the Arctic Circle to global buyers in the south.
So just to say that Spice in the end was forced out of business, but ice cube mining is a practice that you can find in Alaska, in Greenland, in cocktail bars in London that I've been to. You can have glacier ice in your cocktail because you have amazingly clear ice, and as it melts, all of the compressed air starts to sizzle. So it's also a very kind of like dramatic kind of event. And then I'm going to wrap up with just to show you some images from a recent workshop with students in the Canadian subarctic region called the Yukon, where we worked with students to do a sound mapping project. It was called Sounding Ice, an acoustic cartography exploring the signals of climate change found in and around the Yukon and Klondike rivers, their confluences and histories. So we used different microphones. The students and I, there's maybe a couple hundred field recordings. They're all on this website. You can listen to them. And it was really just about working with young people to develop an awareness and understanding how they might use sound as a method for tuning into the signals of climate change. I mean, in the end, they ended up recording all kinds of things. So the project sort of sprawled. It wasn't strictly speaking only about like climate change. They did recordings of all kinds of things that they thought was personally kind of relevant. And the other sound-based project that I've produced has been an album where I've gathered different field recordings, lots that I've done, but others that other people have shared with me. And that was recently in an exhibition in London at the Wellcome Trust. And I'm going to end today's presentation with this is the little bespoke. This is the listening room where people could listen to these tracks, and I'll just play one of the tracks to give you a sense of the kind of really extraordinary acoustic kind of properties of glaciers. Okay, so I think I'm going to end, I will end here, so we can turn the lights on. Maybe I'll go to my, I get a bit of, I'm just going to go here so it's a bit, maybe we'll go there. There we go. So a bit of light in the room. So yeah, that's what I have to share with you today, and I hope that it made sense, and you have a sense of, made sense, but also gives you a sense of the different kinds of methods that I've been trying to develop, both with communities, with students, but also using sound and image to tune into the transformations that are taking place within the cryosphere. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything that you might have, and really appreciate, just to say, I really appreciate the opportunity to share the work with you today, and look forward to our discussion if you want to, if you have time to stick around. So thank you very much. Okay.
Pues nada, muchas gracias, Susan. Vale, pasamos con el turno de preguntas. Ya veo que hay por allí la primera.
Bueno, pues saludo a la audiencia. Mi primera pregunta es si los testigos de hielo tienen que tener una dimensión específica, tanto de longitud como de espesor. La segunda pregunta, me gustaría ver que hubiesen cartografiado el archipiélago de Asbat y cuáles son su población, y algo que yo concluyo.
Great. Thank you for the question. So the first question was about the thickness of the ice. So yes, and maybe you're already probably imagining this, to extract an ice core, you can only do that in places where the ice is incredibly stable. And ice, so glaciers are constantly moving. They're moving, many meters every year. So this is why ice coring operations really tend to happen in in Antarctica, as they go the most significant place, and then Greenland, because you have areas of the ice cap that is incredibly stable, that has minimal movement, because you can't go down with a drill if you're actually, over many years, if the ice is actually shifting. I mean, it does happen, and it's a huge problem, and there's been many drills that get broken, and the hole has to be abandoned because of the dynamics of the ice. So the video that you saw in the Canadian Arctic, that was very, very shallow. So yes, of course, you can go down several hundred meters and you're probably okay. But what you really want is the oldest ice, because the oldest ice is going to give us the information and what we need. And so we really do have to find the places where there's going to be the least amount of movement, because the ice is sitting on the bedrock. And there is always a certain, like they call it, lubrication between the ice and the rock, and that there's a certain kind of film of water, and the ice is always sort of moving to some degree. But this is why those very deep cores that can take us back in time 1 million years have to be cored in Antarctica, basically. The second question was around mapping the villages. So the environmentalist whose voice we heard, Nishant, yes, he has been mapping the sort of, right now, the 45 villages in the Ladakh region that are experiencing this kind of extreme water scarcity. But what he's been trying to do, and there's two things, is the extreme water scarcity means that farms, basically, even when the glaciers are still present, unfortunately, the meltwater is coming too early in this year, so the melt is happening before the farmers would traditionally plant their crops, so they're out of sync. So farming is becoming incredibly difficult. So you also have a phenomena of young people leaving mountain villages to go into like the main city, which is Leh. So you also have a migration of youth away from rural parts of India in this part of the world. And you also, that's combined with the fact that you have also a lack of fresh water. So those two things mean that the countryside is becoming depopulated. Nishant, what he's trying to do is develop an artificial glacier project and to grow glaciers. They create these sort of bamboo structures, and they use hoses in the wintertime to try and basically they create structures to freeze and hold. It's like creating a large architecture that is holding millions of liters of water. So they're trying to, in some way, store water in the hopes that they can bring, and villagers are working with them to bring villagers back to these kind of villages. Now, I myself was not involved in mapping this, but I teach in a unit at Goldsmiths in London where we do a lot of mapping with the students. Is one of the things that we do a lot of, but I myself did not do any mapping in Ladakh. So thank you for those two questions, yeah.
Muchas gracias por la información que nos ha facilitado, muy interesante. Resulta bastante comprensible entender cómo se codifica o decodifica el núcleo de hielo, la columna. Más difícil de entender es cómo son las estructuras de glaciar artificial o cómo se decodifican los sonidos del glaciar en datos.
Great. I wonder, I'm just going to see if I can, this might be crazy to try and do this live. Let me see if I can find a picture of a spectrogram. Sorry, I was looking for a spectrogram. Probably don't have it. So the question is about how you decode these acoustic information. So, and I might try and find it, but what you have to do, the challenge in using audio, so I guess two things I should say. In the field of the study of glaciers historically is part of the physical earth sciences, and usually involves a glaciologist putting stakes into the bed of the glacier. You locate those stakes today with a GPS. And we did the same thing at Drang Drung over the 18 kilometers of the bed of the glacier. We installed these bamboo stakes, located them with the GPS, and then, so the next year you go back and you see how much those stakes have moved. And this is a very kind of this is a very, let's say, traditional practice in the field of glaciology. Remote sensing by satellite has really changed the ways that glaciers have been monitored, especially because they're usually in fairly inaccessible places. And of course, there's also, one could sit, a friend of mine is an ice sheet modeler, and he sits in his kitchen in Copenhagen monitoring the glacier sheets of Greenland. He doesn't need to go anywhere. He can just download the data. But when it comes to using acoustics to monitor glaciers, this is a very innovative and new addition to the tools for glacial monitoring. As I said, Oscar and his colleagues at Scripps, which is based in the United States in California, they're sort of pioneers in using this. And it's really to say that it's not replacing any of these other traditional methods, but it's another way to bring another set of, another data set actually to, so along with the data from the field scientists, the remote sensing data, you can use acoustic data and you want to correlate all that. The challenge with acoustic data is we're talking about real-time recordings over months. And of course, you can't listen back to that in real time because that would take you the same amount of, if you do a 6-month recording, you'd have to listen for 6 months. So the acoustic data gets translated into a spectrogram. And so that's the analysis is actually done in some way. The acoustic data becomes visual data, and then the different frequencies are using different sort of you can use different algorithms to understand the significance of different frequencies. So for one, I mean, I have one of the clips, which is, it's a really interesting clip because what you hear are these, and I can maybe try and find it as well. You hear these strange sound in and amongst the ice, and what it is it's actually a bearded seal. It's a strange, eerie howling that this bearded seal is making. And so Oscar was saying, like, not only do they, when they're analyzing the spectrogram to understand, is this a calving event, meaning has a major part of the glacial wall broken off? That's very dramatic. You see a really significant kind of peaking. But what they're trying to understand, you can read in the spectrogram, is the rate of melting, and that's what's really being studied in the spectrogram. But it means that basically you're having to develop an acoustic cartography, an acoustic map or an acoustic baseline for every glacier. It's like a sonic signature, and then you would have to compare that in subsequent kind of years. But the problem with the sounds of seals and whales and other, you also have to take those animal sounds out of the data set. So it's a very, these frequencies that are registered by these acoustic instruments, they're taking in on all kinds of information. Also, maybe the sensor is like rubbing against big chunks of ice that are moving in, which is always the case in Svalbard. There's much more ice in the water than there's a lot of ice in the water, and that's also sometimes, it can even cut the microphones. So you're having to take out the animal sounds, take out the sounds of the ice hitting the kind of instrumentation to have some more, let's say, an accurate picture in your spectrogram of, okay, this frequency is the pattern of this happening. This we can see calving events, and how does that relate to the data that we can capture with the remote sensing? So there's satellites that are specifically only looking at ice. The cryosat is one, and others that are looking at sea ice. So they're purpose-built ice sensors. So they're correlating the acoustic data with these other kinds of data to have a kind of more kind of complete picture. So in some way, what's a bit of a shame is that, that's the wrong way to put it, but I'm very interested in like sonic methods, but I do understand that with this kind of method of studying glaciers using an audio array, you are ultimately translating the acoustic data into a visual representation, because it means that you don't have to listen in real time to 6 months. You can compress 6 months into an image that's is basically as large as your screen. Does that answer your question?
Creo que he entendido bien si se refiere a que los datos decodificados tienen determinada significación. En este caso sería movimiento del glaciar, volumen probablemente de la masa aportada y algún aspecto más que se me escapa.
Yeah, no, perfecto, yeah, exactly.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Pues aprovecho yo, Susan, que primero que muchísimas gracias por la conferencia, y tenía la duda, ¿no? Como en estos procesos como de acumulación de datos desde distintos lugares, ¿no? Como hablaste con la memoria oral, ¿no? Como el planteamiento científico también de la última pregunta y todas estas cuestiones, ¿cómo te acercas tú desde el punto de vista de cineasta, ¿no? O de registradora de imágenes a todos estos procesos? Si hay algún tipo de... ¿Cómo te aproximas a la grabación? ¿Cómo eso se traduce luego al campo de la edición de vídeo? ¿Qué tipo de cosas dejas fuera? ¿Qué te interesa dejar dentro en este testimonio a través de imagen de todos estos procesos, ¿no? En algunos de tus trabajos?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I suppose also a bit of a complicated one. I think of myself in some way as, I'm interested in telling stories, and in some way, and it's not so different from the book Material Witness that I wrote, where I was, let's say, a mediator between the world of law and all of its abstractions, or we could say the same with, the world of aesthetics has its own abstractions, so art has its own internal logic, languages, modes of representation. So I think I see myself as I said, as a storyteller, but also sort of mediator between different fields of knowledge production, different, let's say, epistemological systems. So that's what I'm interested in, telling a kind of story and bringing in some way people, working with affected communities on the ground. So that's always a big part of my practice is more workshop based. And my job is as a teacher, and I spend most of my time working with our MAs and PhDs. That's what I do 90% of the time. I'm working with students, helping them develop their own kinds of projects. So in my own work, it's about, I guess, like for me, what's maybe the biggest challenge is like, as Walter Benjamin called it, the task of the translator, is translating different experiences, different forms of knowledge production. And I see my practice as one of, like, as I said, storytelling, mediation, and like trying to translate between different forms of expertise, and also produce and take people into situations on the ground and have a sense of the kind of complexity. Like, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but one thing I would, is really important for me is there's lots of artists that I've met work on ice because of its melancholic dimension. The ice is melting, and it's this amazing, translucent, other world, like this sort of spectral material. There's a lot of artists who are fascinated by ice because of its, as I said, its melancholic dimension. It's literally vanishing in front of our eyes. And for me, I want to sort of refuse the melancholic. I want to not focus on just vanishing glaciers and ice loss, but to try and tell stories about the communities whose lives are dependent on these reserves of ice, the ways in which scientists are working with ice as a material in their own practice, and the stories that scientists also share about their kind of own kind of experience. So for me, I've always, in all of my work, I find it very useful to work with materials that people have a relationship to. So ice is very ordinary. It's also incredibly extraordinary. It's some, you know, as an artist, I'm working with a material that most people have some familiarity with, and I think that's amazing because that's why with the moving ice, it's like you can follow ice into so many different sort of contexts because we're also dealing with frozen water, of course. So working with a material that is relatively ordinary in the sense that most people have some sort of relationship to it, and then following that material through different kinds of histories and different sort of contexts, and then trying to tell us sort of, in some way, a broader kind of story. And this is the case for, there's work that I didn't show today, which is, as I said, the investigative work with forensic architecture, where we really looked at the ways in which cold was weaponized against migrants moving from the U.S. into from Mexico, into the U.S. detention system, and they're put into these. They're called glaciers. This is what people refer to them, this icebox detention, which is the temporary holding cells that Latin American migrants are put in as they cross the border into the United States before they end up in the official sort of asylum system. So lots of human rights organizations have been documenting all of the reports of hypothermia in those holding cells. So within forensic architecture work, because it's human rights-based, more investigative, that was looking at another aspect of, let's say, of cold and of ice, which was temperature. So I felt like, okay, I've done all this work with climate scientists, with communities experiencing water scarcity. I also need to confront the fact that that thermal properties, the property of cold, is also a weapon in certain contexts and is actually the source of human rights violations. In Europe, we're quite familiar with the migrants moving from Italy into France who've experienced extreme hypothermia, right, crossing the kind of mountains, very unprepared to be in those kind of environments. So, different work requires different kinds of approaches and methods. So with the forensic architecture method, which was, okay, these are human rights violations. I'm not going to work with poetics. I'm not going to work with sound. I just want to tell provide a very fact-based account of what is going on. I'm not going to try and develop other aesthetic and sensorial registers. I just wanted it to be like 3 stories. One of them deals with the what's called freezing deaths in Canada, where First Nations were taken by police, dropped off in the middle of winter on the outskirts of town, and then forced to walk back in freezing temperatures, like -20, and were found frozen to death. This is a practice that happened in Canada from the 70s. The last case that we came across was 2005. So, and then the use of water hoses at Standing Rock against water protectors. So with investigative work, I think that work requires a different kind of approach, which isn't about producing sort of a certain extra aesthetic effective kind of like experience. But in my other projects, I do want that to keep that register. Even though I might be, providing a fair bit of information, I still want the project to have another register, that it can also just be more phenomenological and experience and encounter. And we can sometimes tune out a little bit, just the sort of more like the delivery of information. So I think every project kind of needs to be specific to the context, I would say, yeah.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for this fascinating topic. So I have a lot of technical questions, but I would say my main one is, what would be your advice for someone who is interested in working in topics like this? So, for example, in my case, I'm a physics and astrophysics graduate with some remote sensing experience within a research project for under a year, but I'm really interested in climate proxies and data analysis in general, and also if a PhD would be strictly necessary for data analysis roles, or if you can go into industry without one, just with a master's and some experience. Thank you.
I mean, that's great to hear that you're doing this kind of work. I mean, we work, our MA, for example, we have 50 MA students, and they're doing amazing work, I would say. I mean, to me, I think you could do the kind of, and one of my PhDs right now, Stavros, he's a remote sensing specialist. He's amazing, and he works on monitoring wildfires in Cyprus and Greece, and looks at the ways in which wildfires have also been sort of I'm not going to go into his whole project, but just to say that he's looking at a kind of ecology of fire practices, only part of which can be understood through like something like remote sensing. So looking at the kind of history of insurgent practices and fires, but also the ways in which the sort of the right in in Greece has really scapegoated migrants and saying that migrants are starting all of these sort of fires. So what I would say, this is just to answer your question, like the kind of work that I think that we do and that I suppose I would be interested in is, how does remote sensing and sort of data science become part of a constellation of practices? And so I guess I'm an advocate for interdisciplinary kind of work, but I think it should always be, it's not like as I always say to the students, just because we're doing interdisciplinary work doesn't mean that we still have to be as precise and accurate as possible. But I think that I would say an MA is absolutely sort of sufficient for doing the kind of technical data science. For me, a PhD is in some way opens up a space of sort of critical kind of reflection, and it's a long-term kind of research project. Now, I'm based in the humanities, so that's why I'm saying that, where I think doing kind of very kind of like practical work that goes out into the world, that can do things, that can make claims. You don't need a PhD to do that. I think a PhD opens up a different kind of conceptual space for, I think, positioning your own project perhaps in a longer history, in a kind of more in a community. So I think, I'm happy to have a sort of a conversation with you, but about your own specific kind of interest. But I think it's always exciting if you can work and find people like kindred, I call them kindred spirits, people you have a shared interest and you can somehow find a place to work together. So that's through my work with the sort of ice cores. I had to learn a lot, of course, and do a lot of reading of like scientific journals and things, that I had a reasonable capacity to have conversations with people that weren't just super basic. And it's amazing. I mean, maybe this goes to the question that came from over here. As a media-based artist, and I have a sound practice, and I understood like acoustic kind of like the use of different acoustic software, etc. That's something that I already had as part of my toolkit that I could bring to the work in India. So acoustics enters into the field of glaciology from the outside, from another set of disciplines. So, and like artists, musicians, sonic practitioners have in-depth knowledge of those practices and can actually contribute to something that, say, glaciologists, it's not that it developed internally to glaciology, so sound was something that built a bridge for me between my interests in in media practices and climate science. And I also worked in the Netherlands with these researchers who study clouds, and we were working on like feedback loops together, and like feedback is really important phenomenon in acoustics, but also in climate science. So that sort of predates the sort of ice work. So I guess my short response would be to say, if you can work in an interdisciplinary way and find others who share an interest, and then you bring your data analytics into that sort of area, into conversation, I think that would be enriching for everybody, yeah.
Bueno, pues mil gracias, Susan, de nuevo. Mil gracias también a todos ustedes por haber venido. Y nada, recordarles también que la próxima semana seguiremos empezará el ciclo No Todo en este nuevo año también con otra serie de conferencias. Y bueno, aquí en la Pesteca también que nos veremos por aquí. Así que nada, muchas gracias.
Gracias por todos los cuestiones. Yeah. Thank you for everybody for your time and your interest and your wonderful questions. It's really appreciated. Thank you so much.